Okay, welcome everyone again to the second part of our two-part discussion of Imitation of Life. As I was saying earlier, I was extremely impressed by how class went on Monday, and I hope that and trust that the same will be true for the continuation of our discussion of Imitation of Life today. As we always do, I would like to begin by recapitulating the reading. So we will advance in the slide deck to a summary, or rather a number of questions in which I will be asking you to demonstrate your understanding of Hooks's reading. I believe that for some of you, this is not the first time that you are engaging with this specific reading, because I believe that it is also still featured on the syllabus of race in the Netherlands. And I know that at least some of you are, or rather were, also enrolled in that class. So please, if you were, bring your understanding and any points that were raised in those discussions to bear on this discussion of Hooks's reading. So, the oppositional gaze. In many ways, Hooks roots her concept of the oppositional gaze, her contribution to a growing body of gaze theory, which in the wake of Laura Mulvey's fundamental, foundational visual pleasure in the narrative cinema, launched a discussion of the gaze and the workings of the gaze in film criticism, in film studies. As we discussed in that very first class, in many ways, film criticism would then evolve into a long-standing and still ongoing critique, constant revision of the workings of the gaze in film, always returning critically to that fundamental, foundational article by Laura Mulvey. And Hooks, in many ways, replicates the format that Laura Mulvey uses. So she too will begin from a personal sociological understanding of what it means to look, what role looking plays, how we structure our thinking, how we derive meaning from the act of looking. So she too will trace or will calc her understanding of this concept in a lived reality of practices of looking. And she begins by arguing that looking while Black, or gazing while Black, that this combination of terms, the lived reality of being Black, fundamentally alters what it means to look. And I would love for you to share in which ways race, by default, according to Hook, fundamentally reorients how the gaze works. What does it mean to look while Black, or to gaze while Black, according to Hooks? Caroline.
Well, so she kind of talks about in the beginning, just like from the roots of colonialism and from slavery, that if you are to look, it's kind of seen as like an act of defiance, and how like people were continuously punished for looking whenever they were slaves were punished for looking by their white masters. And she asks the question kind of towards the beginning, like what does that mean when people are now raising their children, under this pretense that the gaze of look and like the process of looking is like considered to be a challenge to power, or like a defiance.
Yes, you're exactly right. At the core, at bottom, Hooks adopts an understanding that of looking, that there is power in looking. To look in and of itself can be interpreted, and is often interpreted for Black people, as an implicit, if not explicit, challenge to authority, to white normativity, to whiteness. And if there is power in looking, and if those acts of looking are interpreted in the mainstream by whiteness as a potential challenge, then there is therefore, according to Hooks, an implicit understanding that Black people should not look, that they should fear the act of looking itself, because it might lead to reprisal, it might lead to punishment. Micah? Did you have any?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I was going to say similar things to Caroline and what you just said, but also, yeah, like, just, then she goes on to explain that, like even though the gaze has always been punished, like Black gaze has always been punished, both in slavery and continued by parents to children, it's never absolute. And then it becomes a site of resistance to like the norms and to white supremacy.
Yes, you're exactly right. And here too, Hooks is anchoring her thinking in an understanding of power that was popularized, that was postulated by Foucault. And if I'm recalling correctly, we did talk about this in class. Where there is power, according to Foucault, there is automatically resistance, or at least the genesis, the aperture of resistance exists. And what Hooks would argue is that if, as a Black person, you are constantly told not to look, in other words, your look is actively repressed, then by that same token, there is an almost physical process that demands that there is an equal and opposite reaction to that injunction to look. In other words, there is this desire, this pent up wanting to cast a gaze. And this will become one of the building blocks for her notion of the oppositional gaze. Tarek?
Yeah, to that point as well, she also mentioned that for the gaze, like a starting point is kind of like outside of like the mainstream culture, in the sense that when they see films, they know that it's like Black representation is being crafted by someone that's white and not Black, so they can see it as, they get like a source of satisfaction in knowing that even though this is like a conception, it's not their it's not how they see like Black lives, or it's not like their experiences. So it's, she mentioned it's both like a source of confrontation, but they also get pleasure in knowing that like these people think they know us, but it's not really how we are.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's exactly right. And that's another key characteristic of the oppositional gaze and of gazing while Black, now specifically in the context of consuming, unpacking, mediated representations. This gaze isn't simply a gaze that's born in resistance. This gaze is a gaze that parses. It's a gaze that seeks to unpack how these representations of Blackness that are produced in a white, dominantly white system, how these representations fail to live up to the lived reality of Blackness. So this oppositional gaze is a gaze that searches, is a gaze that unpacks, is a gaze that critiques. It's a gaze that reads these mediated representations against the grain. It is looking for the flaws that exist in these representations. And this is really a crucial point that Tarek unearthed, there is pleasure to be gained from this critical practice of looking. So Hooks, in speaking with African-American spectators, finds that there is this commonality that for a subset of them, that can be a pleasurable act. Pleasure can be found in critiquing these texts, in looking at these texts askew. Zoe?
Yeah, and another point to go off of how race by default redefines the gaze. It said in the article, which I thought was kind of interesting, was how she said that, or she like drew from people she interviewed that Black female spectators sometimes would essentially like dismiss their subordination and kind of forget racism in a way in order for them to fully experience the pleasure of the cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, if you are of the white race or of a different, like in a status of power, like you won't really have to do that. You can automatically assume that pleasure from the screen.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you've already pinpointed and identified one of the looking relations that Hooks later in the article will go on to enumerate. And according to Hooks, there are 3, if not 4. One is a subset of the other. 4 different looking relations that she identifies when it comes specifically to Black spectators' relationship to mass-mediated texts. And we'll get to that later in our analysis, but you're exactly right. One of them is that for some Black spectators, there must inherently be a denial or a forgetting of these racist structures in order to gain any kind of pleasure from the text. Will?
Yeah, I was also going to say that she grounds her argument a lot. I mean, I'm not sure if it's necessarily grounded, but a lot of it orients around sex and sexuality, and she uses the term phallocentrism to kind of like unpack the way that Black male viewers might find comfort or pleasure in cinema, and that like in this conversation, you know, in this class we talk about liminality, how like the cinema kind of represents this liminal space where Black male viewers can like, I guess, like engage in the gaze of, you know, a white female subject in an environment where there aren't repercussions to that action. Like, and she brings up Emmett Till as like one of her first examples of this, as like he was just like a young kid who I think he didn't even really do anything, and he was like accused of like visually raping a white woman.
Yes, and I've brought up the question here because it's precisely the question that you've answered. Hooks is nothing if not nuanced in her analysis of this oppositional gaze. So what she begins to point out here is that our understanding of this gaze must be complex, and it must attend to other differences that exist among and between Black spectators. So what she wants to avoid is that we conceive of the Black spectator as a unified, monolithic entity. Instead, she wants us to look for other categories of identity that would almost automatically lead to a different type of gaze relationship. And she begins by looking at the issue of gender. And she asks, or she questions, whether Black male spectators and Black female spectators would have the same type of spectatorial relationship with these mediated texts. Drilling a little bit deeper into Will's point, why is it specifically that Black male spectators might have a different relationship to these mass-mediated texts that they're consuming? In other words, what is it specifically that they can draw on that female spectators cannot? Will?
I think she says it's basically just like how like cinema is already built around like a masculine kind of objectification of women. So like already as men, the cinema, regardless of race, is kind of tailored to meet their needs.
Yes, that's exactly right. So Hooks is saying the male gaze, as theorized by Laura Mulvey, continues to be operative. These texts are, on one level, made for male spectators. So even though a Black male spectator is going to unpack this text in radically different ways from a white male spectator, their shared masculinity will mean that there are certain meanings in the text that will be equally available to, equally unlocked by white male spectators and Black male spectators. So if we want to give some examples of what this might mean specifically, what would it mean specifically? What is it that Black male spectators, if we return to this understanding of the gaze by Mulvey, would be able to derive from the text? Emma?
I guess I was gonna say something kind of similar to Will for the last bit. So I guess kind of just like a sense of power
Yes.
over the situation. So
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's that sense of power that would explain why the cinema is such a powerful place for male spectators specifically. Will drew on the example of Emmett Till. And in many ways, those two positions are the polar opposites of the spectatorial spectrum. Emmett Till was brutally and fatally punished for the simple act of casting a look at a white female person. Obversely, on the opposite side of that spectrum, Black male spectators would be able to go into movie theaters and cast a prolonged gaze at female characters on the screen, and they would be able to do this in a darkened space. In other words, where the normal social censor that so powerfully relegated Emmett Till to a position where he was not allowed to look and then fatally punished for looking. The opposite would be the place in a darkened auditorium in a movie theater. And that would explain why this sense of power that Black male spectators do not experience in their day-to-day lives, they now have access to in a movie theater. Marcel?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that this sense of power is probably also like significantly larger for the Black male spectator, because when a white male spectator goes into a theater, he's seeing white women and maybe Black women, both which he has had like previous sexual experiences with, whether it was consensual or not. But Black men like really were not allowed to. And like, I mean, like we talked about Emmett Till, like he got punished just for looking at one. So obviously Black men weren't allowed to sleep with white women. So the power of the gaze was like even stronger for them in the theater, because they were like taking on like like being a spectator for a character that they would never be able to play in like real life.
Yes, that's exactly right. Because, or another dimension of this is, of course, that there were rarely, if ever, any texts that would focalize or have in a leading role African-American characters. According to Hooks, the baseline condition for the representation of African-American people in Hollywood has been traditionally absence. In other words, their presence is negated. They are not included in these texts. I believe I may have missed it. Claudia, did you have your hand up as well? Or maybe you put your virtual hand, back down. One point that Hooks makes, and it goes again to her fundamentally different understanding of the text itself, of the film text, is that she argues that even texts that are produced in mainstream Hollywood studios, in other words, that are inflected by whiteness, that come out of a white supremacist system of cultural production, even those texts contain within them what she calls moments of rupture. What does she mean by that? Moments where the text itself ruptures. Claudia?
It's basically like a moment where the spectator stops like identifying with what's happening on screen, and it's like a moment for especially Black female spectators to look at films critically and like thus creating the oppositional gaze, because they're recognizing that like what's happening on screen is not a reflection of their reality, and they don't accept what's happening anymore.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's beautiful. These are moments where the fiction simply becomes too much to be borne. And at that point in time, there is a disidentification. There is an establishing of distance between the Black female spectator specifically and the screen. And we know how important distance is. Distance equals, signifies knowledge production. It is one of those baseline conditions for the production of knowledge and critical insight. We must not be too close to the text. And there is, in film studies, no mechanism by which we come closer to the text than identification. Identification equals an absence, a letting go of this critical distance. That's what it means to identify. So in these moments of rupture, Black female spectators specifically disidentify with specific characters and therefore from the text as a whole. And that's where this oppositional gaze is then leveraged to read the text against the grain. So I'm going to urge you, when we move on to scene analysis, to question whether any of these scenes in specifically could potentially lead to a moment of rupture where Imitation of Life itself ruptures, and to tell me why you believe this text might potentially be too much, why those specific scenes might lead to an excess that would produce this rupture in the text, where the text itself is no longer unified. So as I said earlier, Hooks would argue that the image of Black women in film for the vast majority of film history is marked by absence or negation. What's the difference between the two? What does it mean for Black women to be absent from text? And what does it mean for them to be negated? Lainey?
Yeah, so I think absence is like they're just completely unincluded in film, so like old films who don't have any Black characters. And then negation is kind of like misrepresentations of like Black women in films. I think of like Mammy and Gone with the Wind and kind of the traditional role of Mammy and how that is often a negation of the existence of Black women in real life who like lead different lives than that, and it's just a misrepresentation.
Precisely. Thank you so much. Yes, that's excellent. So by absence, we mean that there is a lack of inclusion. So Black women are simply not included in these texts. And when they are, the representation is not a well-rounded representation. These are not three-dimensional characters in the way that white characters in these texts are. What Hooks argues is that their closeness to these white characters means that when Black characters do appear in text, they only play a role that is intimately tied to the white character. In other words, the Black character serves to reveal a certain aspect of the white character's personality, of their specific plight, of their relationship to the plot. In other words, the relationship is functional. Black characters serve a functional purpose for the white characters in the text. Either they illustrate something about those characters, or they help those characters come to insights that either relate to themselves and their own personal development, or to the plot, to the story of the film itself. This concept of the negation of Black characters is one that endures in mass media, in Hollywood representations of Blackness until today. Many of you are probably familiar with the trope of the Black friend, for example, where the Black friend again serves solely and simply to reveal something or affect some type of change on the part of their white friends. Hooks then argues that when we do see representations of Black women in film, their bodies are instead meant to serve and enhance white womanhood as an object of the phallocentric gaze. Who can translate this for me? So Black female characters serve to enhance and maintain white womanhood as object of the phallocentric gaze. Shreya?
Yeah, so at one point, Hooks was talking about how a lot of the most popular white actresses, they were actually brunettes, but they were made blonde. And she was relating that to the obsession with white womanhood and like white features and maintaining a certain distance from womanhood, and also to perpetuate white supremacy like through that.
Yes. Yes, you're exactly right. Can anyone think of an example that we've discussed in class where we have seen Black female characters serve to literally build, construct, craft white womanhood as an object of the male gaze? Tarek, you can either answer that question or simply say what you were planning on saying.
Yeah, my answer to that question was what I was planning on saying. I think in Gone with the Wind, there's the scene where I forgot the Mammy character, she's like literally tying Scarlett into her white womanhood, and we talked about that previously. But also in Imitation of Life, there's like a scene in the middle of the movie where again Annie's tying Laura into her like womanhood when she's like getting her ready for some party or something, and she's like making sure she like looks good, everything's fine, like she's presentable. So like these scenes, like they're just enhancing them and making sure that like they're conforming to everything they need to be in order to like be that desired object. And instead of like them getting what they want to be, she wants them to be able to look like something to be had, like they can be God instead of them actually getting something.
Brilliant. Yes, that's absolutely brilliant. In other words, again, it's either the physical or the emotional or the mental labor that Black female characters provide so that white female characters can take up their designated role in the text. And you are so right to point out that there are multiple examples of this in Imitation of Life. And I would argue that it's a baseline in Imitation of Life. The only way that Laura Meredith can perform, literally and figuratively, because as an actress, it is her role to perform. All of those performances are only made possible by Annie. And it is, in fact, Annie's addition to the quote unquote family, or to, if you will, the household economy. It is only when Annie becomes a part of Laura Meredith's household that her career takes off. In other words, it is only because that labor is now done by Annie that Laura Meredith can transition from being an obscure actress to one of the most famous actresses in the US. It is on the basis of, on the back of Annie's labor. Hooks, at this point, refers to this concept of ultra whiteness. In those scenes specifically, where this concept of crafting white womanhood by Black female characters comes into stark focus, what is produced isn't just white femininity, it is an ultra white femininity. What does she mean by this? And I would be the first to admit that she doesn't readily spell this out in the article, but what do you think it means? That what we end up with, the sum total of that labor, is an ultra whiteness. Will?
I think it goes back to what Tarek said about Mammy as like the guardian or the guard or like the watchtower person. I don't know. I'm losing the analogy, but of white femininity, in that like the role of like he was saying, like the role of Black women is in this historic cinema is literally just to show like what is femininity and what is not, and to kind of like again like degrade Black women into this kind of like animalistic depiction versus where it's held up against like the ultra refined, ultra dainty white person.
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. In other words, the ultra quality of whiteness can only enter into the equation when a distance is established between that which is not white, which is not ultra white. In other words, this ultra whiteness only emerges in the context of and in direct opposition and juxtaposition to a Black female body. And there are multiple scenes in Imitation of Life where this comes to the fore. One we will be analyzing a little bit later on. But again, the distillation of it is, as Tarek already mentioned, that freeze frame of Mammy roping Scarlett into that corset. That production of Scarlett as ultra white is intimately tied to the labor done by Mammy and to Mammy's forced labor in that scene. So ultra whiteness reestablishes and distances even further Black female characters from white female characters in the text. So that distance is extended, that distance is heightened. As I mentioned earlier, I think this was in response to, I believe it was either Zoe's or Tarek's response. Hooks establishes 3 ways, largely, in which Black female characters can respond to the assault being these constant warped representations of Black womanhood that appear in mainstream Hollywood fictions. What are those 3 viewing positions, and what characterizes them specifically? Simply put, Hooks argues that there are 3 responses, 3 ways in which Black female spectators respond to mass media representations of Blackness on the screen. Micah?
Well, I think one is that they see the images of Blackness on the screen and separate that from themselves and think like that isn't who we are. Kind of specifically, she talks about that when she was a child and she got really angry at the portrayals of Black women, and she was kind of trying to separate and say like that's not who we are.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
That's maybe one.
Yes, you're exactly right. And that specific looking relationship, Hooks will later on go to call an oppositional gaze. In many ways, that's one of the fundamental dynamics in which this oppositional gaze is born. It's a resistance to, it's a frustration with, it's a pulling away from the screen. And that's this oppositional gaze. That's one characteristic of the oppositional gaze. But there are 2 other ways in which Black female spectators might respond. In other words, not a gaze that is necessarily oppositional. Claudia?
I think one of them was how Black women allow themselves to like be transformed so that they can feel the viewing pleasure of white women, and like kind of ignore the racism in the film with that, like, so they don't read too much into it, so they can have that like viewing pleasure that they can't really have as Black women.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So one is simply looking, it is extending the look, but it is an attempt to forget or put aside or suspend the racist structures that are operative in the text. It is a type of complicit looking. So complicity is the word that Hooks uses. It is a willful forgetting. It's not entirely forgetting, it's a putting aside temporarily these racist structures to be able to continue to identify with the text. Tarek?
Also, I think one of them had to do with kind of like a direct identification, because she talks about her own experience watching a particular movie, and she mentioned like the trope of like the sapphire, like a fiery black woman, and like um how like reviews of it were like putting down like the black character. And when she was younger, she thought that it was just like a stereotypical character to have, but as she got older, she kind of identified more with the role and assumed that these people don't like know this like the Sapphire's troubles and woes and like what she goes through. So it was much more of a sense of like in her youth, she was very, very against this representation. And like as she got older, she's more, not everyone can understand like what she's going through. And you have to like go through a certain process like she did personally to kind of like identify and get like her problems.
Yes, that's beautifully put. So initially, the response might be one of outright rejection or dismissal, to say that is not me, this representation is not me, I will hide from this representation. Think again of Malcolm X's response to Prissy in Gone with the Wind, where he said, I wish I could have ducked beneath my chair because I did not want to see that representation of Black femininity on the screen. But as Hooks argues later on, with sort of a reclaiming of specific characters, there is the possibility of outright identification because your understanding of those characters changes, their understanding changes. Yes, Micah? Or Emma?
So I put my hand down. You can go, Emma.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm quite looking in the right place, but is another one, resisting identifications with the film consciously. I know there was a quote in the text that said, where she was talking about that the cinema didn't feel like it had any place for her. So I thought that might be another way.
Yes, and that is actually the first way. One looking relationship is not to look. In other words, not looking, not engaging with these texts, not consuming these movies, because from the outset, there is, on these female spectators' parts, there is no hope. There is nothing to be gained from engaging with these texts. So the response is not to look at all, not to engage with them at all. So we have not looking, we have a type of complicit looking, we have a desire to look or re-look, reappropriate, which can ultimately lead to identification, and we have this oppositional gaze. Those are the three looking relationships that Hooks identifies in the text. At one point, Hooks refers specifically to her experience watching Imitation of Life. Now, this is not the Imitation of Life that we're analyzing today. This is the 1934 version of Imitation of Life. But again, this version has the exact same source text. It is the exact same novel by Fannie Hurst, and it has the exact same characters, but it has them in different settings. And Hooks argues or explains or shares that there was one experience in particular where any pleasure that she had, quote, ended abruptly. Which character was that? Caroline?
It was Sarah Jane.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and why, according to Hooks, was that representation of Sarah Jane in the 1930s text, where her name is Piola, it's not Sarah Jane, why was that representation, why was that character's arc so traumatizing? Why did it make it impossible to derive any pleasure from the scenes that she was in?
Well, from what I remember, she said that that she, and I think it was her sisters that she was watching it with, like cried and cried alongside this character because they like felt so emotionally connected to this her feelings basically throughout the film, that like she was like, well, why can't I just be white, or like I don't want to I think Annie said at one point, like, how do you explain to your child that she was born to be hurt? And like all of these different aspects to Blackness that, like, when they were watching the film, they really related to like Sarah Jane's like trauma, and I think that that's what emotionally like hurt them.
Yes, yes, exactly. It has to do with passing as a reality, a lived reality, and then the mediated representation of it, where these characters who either want to or are forced to pass are put in an absolutely impossible position where there is no way out, where there is no potential happiness at the end of the narrative. And this is held true for many representations of passing, both in literature, in film, and in television or in media at large. And it has given, or it has led to the trope or the character of the tragic mulatto. In other words, the character who passes is by default in her or his representation a tragic character. There is a tragedy imbued that lives in the very concept, the very lived reality of not belonging wholly to either of these racial categories. This sense of falling betwixt and between has given rise to, again, this trope in literature and narratives writ large that focalize on passing, where you have a tragic character. Tarek?
On page 122 of the reading, she also mentions exactly what you said. And she said, like, there was no place in cinema for her, like, no loving pictures. And that reminds me of the scene when a young Sarah Jane is, like, picking the dolls, and she chooses, and she wants to play with the white one instead of the black one. But there's, like, no doll that's kind of like, for lack of a better term, brown, or one that's, like, more akin to what she, like, truly is through and through. Like, the doll scene, like, sets up like this binary of just, like, black and white, and there's not, like, the gray area, the in between, that's not necessarily fully one or the other.
Yes, that is just absolutely brilliant, Tarek, because that will in fact form the basis for Sarah Jane's complicated process of identification with these two mothers that she has. Because in Imitation of Life, both children, Sarah Jane and Susie, have two mothers. There is this double representation of motherhood in the film. For Sarah Jane, both of those models are found wanting. Both of those models of motherhood are flawed. And in the scenes that we will be analyzing, we'll see how the constant performances that Sarah Jane engages in the film are drawn from, are based on performances, actions that she has seen either her biological mother, Annie, do, or that she has learned from living with Laura Meredith. But neither of those models work for her. Neither of those models can capture her lived reality in the same way that neither of those dolls work for her. There is simply no model, there is no representation that she can turn to. Spruce?
Yeah, I was also going to say, it seems throughout the film that there's this tragedy because while she's trying to grapple with her identity and sort of doing these stunts as a way to kind of like ruffle the current and like have some sort of reaction or resolution, that resolution never really happens. And so like there's never a critical discourse that happens between her and her mothers or her sister. So it just is sort of this like ongoing tragic reality for her too.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. And this, of course, we can explain within the generic parameters of the melodrama. These characters cannot have a critical discourse on the sociological reality of passing because they don't have access to that awareness. They don't have the vocabulary. There isn't the understanding of how these forces operate. So it's telling that quote that Caroline remembered, and it's such a haunting quote. How do you tell your child that she is born to be hurt? That is when we fade to black. That is when we transition to another scene. You would expect that in that moment, you would launch into a discussion of why Sarah Jane is born to be hurt, why Annie believes this. But the film cannot have that discussion. It cannot engage openly with that problematic. It can butt against it, it can broach it, it can open up the wounds, but it can't actually examine it. Because that would give these characters an agency or an understanding that they cannot have in a melodramatic text. Claudia?
Yeah, I think you just answered my question, but I was just going to ask, like, the melodrama as a genre, like, from what I understand, you're saying that it can introduce, like, counter narratives, but can't necessarily engage in them just because it's, like, a limitation of the genre?
Yes, that's exactly right. In part because these texts were produced by major Hollywood studios who were not at all interested in engaging in overtly, quote unquote, political discourse. That was not something that at the time in the 1950s specifically, movie studios were interested in engaging in. This text was produced only 3 years after the ban was lifted on any representation of interracial sexuality on the screen. So it would have been entirely too soon for a text like Imitation of Life to openly engage in a discussion of passing. Now, it shows the effects, it shows the consequences throughout when it comes to the character and the arc of Sarah Jane, but it cannot have a discussion, an honest discussion of why that is. In other words, it cannot say, here are the reasons why in a white supremacist society like the United States, this character will be born to be hurt. It is because of reason X, Y, and Z. It cannot name the forces themselves. That's beyond the scope of these texts. This next question we've already answered. I think all of us have, I hope, a thorough understanding of how this oppositional gaze works. We've already identified a number of the characteristics. It's a gaze that provides its own source of pleasure, but again, that pleasure is found not in identification with the text, but in a resisting and a critical parsing and an unpacking and a reading against the grain of the text, looking for ways in which these representations of Black femininity and specifically are flawed and are produced by and for white people. I began this class by taking us back to Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and the Narrative Cinema, and I argued that film criticism, which soon developed a subset of theories that would later come to be called gaze theory or gaze theories, Hooks is clearly writing in the long wake of Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and the Narrative Cinema, and she has a bone to pick with Mulvey. In fact, she has multiple bones to pick with Mulvey and with Visual Pleasure and the Narrative Cinema specifically. What are some of those bones? What are some of those criticisms that Hooks levels at Mulvey and at Mulvey's framework? Micah?
One of the things she talks about is, like, Laura Mulvey creates like a binary opposition between women and men, but Black women don't fall into either of those categories, and so they're unable to fit into that binary, and so she, thinks that Mulvey is incorrect in her analysis of just a complete split between men and women.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the irony is that Mulvey clearly wants to take apart a system that is rooted in binary oppositions, But what she ends up doing is refortifying, cementing in place those same binary oppositions. The male gaze, visual pleasure in the narrative cinema, the male gaze is a concept. And the entire framework that she builds to support the existence of that context relies on binaristic thinking, relies on a totalizing approach to how gender is infused in, works in the text. So she ends up making more powerful the systems that she seeks to dismantle. Lainey?
Yeah, I was kind of just gonna say the same thing where it Hooks basically says that Mulvey makes it so that the gaze is just all dominating white male, and it makes the relevant opposition male and female rather than white and black. And also that Hooks kind of like says that Mulvey brings up black female spectatorship really kind of brings it up quickly and then just dismisses it and doesn't really like go into it, I think is what she said.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes, Lainey, you're exactly right. So what Mulvey does is exactly what film has done. Mulvey engages in the same practices of absence and negation. Either she erases black female spectatorship completely. In other words, she doesn't engage with black female spectators. She simply lumps them in with female spectators as a unified cohort. Or when she does, she negates their importance. She negates the relevance of black female spectatorship, mentions it and dismisses it. Absence and negation, which have characterized the representation of black female characters in film, also characterizes how those characters have been analyzed in film theory. So it's a closed loop. Catherine?
She also says that feminist film criticism it kind of emerged from a women's liberation movement that was rooted in racist practices and informed by racist practices. So that kind of was built upon the negation and absence of Black women, which is kind of why I think feminist film criticism kind of continued with that same practice.
Correct. Yes, that's exactly right. So we trace the emergence of feminist film criticism to the 1970s. We know that Visual Pleasure in the Narrative Cinema was written in 1974. This is the heyday of second wave feminism, the women's liberation movement. And Laura Mulvey writes the text, or the text has been widely received and exists today as a piece of critical theory, but she meant it to be a manifesto. She meant for Visual Pleasure in the Narrative Cinema to lead to political action. She wrote the text not simply as an academic, she wrote it as a second wave feminist. She wrote it as a member of an advocacy group, of a political community. So she lived in, breathed in that activism. And that activism was characterized by an exclusion of any type of racialized otherness and was led by, dominated by, produced by white women. And women of color were excluded from those movements, or their voices were not equal to the voices of white female leaders in those movements. This too, we can map onto Imitation of Life, because Laura Meredith's journey is in many ways a journey of female advancement. We seem to have a female character who is struggling to break into a male-dominated world, who meets men who either treat her as a prop. Think back to the scene where she has to model the flea powder and she's literally used as a prop next to the dog, and the dog is given much more sympathy and much more leeway than she is. Or she has to deal with lecherous directors who clearly imply that the only way that she's going to get ahead is if she trades sexual favors for career advancement. So we seem to have that same story, right? We seem to have a story of a feminist heroine in the making. But what the film shows, I would argue, is that the only way in which Laura Meredith gets to emerge as a star is because of Annie's labor, is because she has Annie in place. Other criticisms that we remember from Hooks. Hooks is not a big fan of the supporting framework that Mulvey draws on to build the concept of the gaze, and that is psychoanalytic theory. Why is she not a fan of psychoanalytic theory? What's the problem with psychoanalysis, according to Hooks? Tarek?
I remember her saying that it prioritizes sexual difference as opposed to other sort of intersectional identities like race. I'm not sure if she mentioned class, but I distinctly remember her saying there's a preference of sexual difference above anything else.
Yes, that's exactly right. So again, there's only one category of identity that psychoanalysis is preoccupied with. And secondly, psychoanalysis tends to have an ahistorical point of view. In other words, it treats the concepts that it studies as immobile, as immoving, as not subject to sociological change. It sees these as constants. The human psyche and the way in which the human psyche works is a constant process. It doesn't change. And the type of criticism that Hooks engages in, critical race studies, as a field, is finely attuned to the ways in which societies change, practices change. It is not an ahistorical discipline, it is very much a historical discipline. It pays attention to the vicissitudes of history. Psychoanalysis argues that these concepts are ahistorical. They're not unique to a specific point in time. And then lastly, and this is one that you didn't mention, but I'm sure many of you did experience if you remember reading Visual Pleasure in the Narrative Cinema for the first time. Hooks has a problem with the jargon. Hooks has a problem with the writing of the text itself, and specifically with the jargon that, that Mulvey uses. Why is that? Spruce?
I'm not sure if this is what you're pointing to exactly. It also kind of fits in with what you were just saying, but she says that Mulvey's use of just the term woman, it kind of abstracts them, and only in that like term, in that use of woman without any sort of context, can, and like when they become fiction or fantasy, race is not seen as significant.
Yes, you're exactly right. So Hooks, or rather Mulvey, relies on this concept of woman with a capital W, one totalizing category of womanhood. This is not surprising because this again is a characteristic of second wave feminist theory. It's not intersectional, so it treats woman with a capital W as a block, as a unified block that behaves in the same way regardless of one's belonging to class, race, or sexual communities. Romy?
She also mentions that the jargon Mulvey uses is very exclusive and only women of certain communities or educational levels or things like that are able to access and understand it. So it excludes Black women in particular who aren't used to that type of language.
Exactly right, which adds insult to injury and only exacerbates the problem, because it's precisely those Black women who are barred from the academy, who are barred from those ivory towers in which this knowledge is produced. In short, in all of these ways that we've just identified, white supremacy structures not just the film text, and remember, this was Mulvey's point. White supremacy, the patriarchy, structures film as a text. It has seeped into film language itself. What Hooks argues is, you're right, but it equally structures film theory. The work you're engaging in simply replicates the problem. You're part of the problem. A same type of white supremacist thinking has suffused film theory, which was supposed to dismantle that system, or at the very least critique that system. Will?
Just one thing I wanted to add. I'm not sure if someone had said it before me, but there's another, it's not directly related to the jargon critique, but she does say that Mulvey kind of locks female and male viewers, again, as people have said in this binary, are passive and active, but she doesn't really leave room for like resistance or just like the choice to just completely remove oneself from the equation. That she says like, she said like Black female spectators actively choose not to identify with the film's imaginary subject because such identification was disabling. So she kind of makes it either, Mulvey kind of locks in the binary that either you have an image forced on you or you elect it, not that like she doesn't leave room for resistance.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, absolutely. Again, totalizing approach. So we're dealing here with a system that cannot in any way be circumvented. It leaves no room for any type of resisting spectatorship. And that's precisely the spectatorship that Hooks is interested in analyzing, and that she has heard from people that she knows, from people who love to engage with film. And that's what leads her to write this article, because she sees all of these gaps, not just in the theory, but in the lived reality of being a Black woman who engages with Hollywood mainstream texts. Hooks never falls into the trap of painting with too broad a brush. And she argues that even though many of these texts that she grew up watching reproduce the narrative of white supremacy, in other words, their deep structure is a white supremacist structure, this is not true for all texts produced by, churned out by Hollywood. Again, some texts have moments of excess where the text ruptures, and this unified white supremacist ideology shows its face, emerges. There are texts that in that moment demystify whiteness. In other words, they show whiteness for what it is. They show whiteness for the system of privilege and oppression that keeps that privilege in place. There are texts that demystify whiteness, that denaturalize whiteness. There are many more texts that simply replicate this deep structure of white supremacy. Where does Imitation of Life fall according to you? Is Imitation of Life a film in the final analysis, after the final scene ends, that reproduces white supremacist thinking, or that at the very least shows what that thinking is, if not outright critiques that thinking? Where would you come down on Imitation of Life? Caroline?
I would say that watching it in the current moment, you could view it as at least an acknowledgement of the system in place, just because that we ourselves are acknowledging of the system in place. But I would argue that if you were to watch it back when it was released, it probably would not be an acknowledgement of that system in place, or like not a critique in that aspect.
Thank you. Tarek?
I think it's like very interesting, and there's not like one direct blanket answer, but I do like every time I think of like positive, I can also think of like a negative to bring it back down. So like if I think of Laura being very nice with Sarah Jane and like telling her to like not be ashamed of who she is and how she accepts her and stuff like that. I can also think of a scene where like she mentions like some boy or some boy that's presumably black or like a lower station that she's expected to be interested in when she says she has a boyfriend, or when she like asks her to like serve the food and stuff, and there's kind of like that implication that, oh, you're just going to follow in your mother's footsteps even though it's not directly said. So like I feel like there's always a leveling. Like every time I think, oh, maybe this is like pushing back, then I just think of something else and I'm like, nah, not really.
Yes, yes, exactly. When the film pushes back, who is the character that pushes back? Who pushes back in this film? Who resists? Romy?
So that's kind of what I was gonna say about Tarek's comment is with Sarah Jane, every time she is subordinated in that way, we see her frustration with it, which calls out the structure in place as something that would frustrate or would be a negative impact. It doesn't just like, it's not like Laura Meredith introduces the idea of the chauffeur's son and then Sarah Jane happily goes and dates him. You can see that she resists that and sees it as an issue, which kind of calls out the structures in place.
Yes, precisely. And this is an excellent segue because the first scene that we will be analyzing in just a couple of minutes is the scene that immediately follows the confrontation between Laura Meredith and Sarah Jane on the staircase. And this is the scene where, as Tarek just said, Laura Meredith blithely assumes that this boy that Sarah Jane is interested in must be the Hawkins boy, must be a black boy. It simply must be. And the scene that we will analyze will be Sarah Jane's response, Sarah Jane pushing back. The reason why I chose to couple Hooks's Oppositional Gaze with Imitation of Life is because Sarah Jane emerges from the beginning as a spectator. Sarah Jane, in many ways, is looking at this representation of life, this imitation of life that Laura Meredith and her mother engage in, both of her mothers engaging. And her point of view is one that resists. She neither fully identifies with Annie or with Laura Meredith. In other words, she casts an oppositional gaze. She seeks to read against the grain. She constantly challenges both Laura Meredith's edicts and her mother's advice. So she emerges as a spectator. And there are many ways in which the film gives us Sarah Jane as someone who is witnessing and commenting on and critiquing the ways in which this life that revolves around her is but an imitation of it. We have an understanding of the oppositional gaze. There is one other part of the essay that I want us to return to, but we will do that in the context of a scene that we will be analyzing. We're now going to be shifting gears, and we're going to return to Imitation of Life. And I want you, specifically, I would like you, first of all, I'm going to re-share my screen. I would like you, specifically now, to analyze how Sarah Jane responds specifically to this assumption on the part of Laura Meredith that she must be dating the Hawkins boy. So what we're going to be seeing is the immediate is the next scene, the scene that immediately follows the confrontation between the two women on the staircase.
There they are.
Can everyone see the media player? Can someone say yes if they see it?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Look, honey, why don't you go over to the party at the church? They bore me. You're making a big mistake. You're young. You shouldn't be sitting around. Miss Laura feels the same way. She'll lend you her car.
Oh, she will. How nice of her.
I'd be happy knowing you're meeting nice young folks.
Busboys, cooks, chauffeurs. Like Hawkins. No, thank you. I've seen your nice young folks.
I don't want to fight with you, honey. Not tonight. I don't feel too good. While I get started on the anchovies, you take this tray into Miss Laura and her friends.
Why, certainly. Anything at all for Miss Laura and her friends.
But, Senor Romano, why should she need rehearsals?
Oh, ma scusa, signor.
You know her work. Her last play was a fantastic success. I'm sure.
Felucci always insists on 2 weeks rehearsal. Pictures are a different medium than the stage. She will need rehearsal. She will...
It's Joel and Mr. Crawdad's, Miss Laura, for you and your friends.
That's quite a trick, Sarah Jane. Where did you learn it?
Oh, no tricks at all, Miss Laura. I learned it from my mammy, and she learned it from old Massa, though she belonged to you.
Well,
Talk to me about this scene. How exactly does Sarah Jane in this scene resist? How does she speak back? Will?
She kind of, I mean, she goes into the strategy of like playing into what she hears people expect of her. So when back in the kitchen, when she's with Annie, she's like, oh, you know, Laura will lend you her car. And she's like, how nice of her. Like, thank you for taking pity on me. And then when she goes to serve the food, she, you know, puts it on her head, which is like, if you look at like a very stereotypical Nat Geo picture of like women in Africa, like that is something that happens. So like she's kind of playing into that. And then she says like, oh, like, where'd you learn that trick? She's like, oh, I learned it from my mom, who learned it from her mom, who learned it from her master. So she's kind of just like really aggressively bringing up the racial discomfort that she feels in her relationship between her and Laura, and like her own, as you said, trope as like the tragic mulatto.
Right. So that's excellent. So we could argue that Sarah Jane is speaking what the film leaves unspoken. Will you bring out the food? Sarah Jane doesn't interpret this as a question. She interprets it as a demand. This is something she must do. This is her role in the family, because this is Annie's role in the family. This is her mother's role in the family. At no point do we ever hear Laura Meredith and Annie talk about the precise labor that it is that Annie is going to provide. All of this is simply assumed. Assumptions are made about the role that Annie will play in this family. But Sarah Jane never rests on assumptions. She is going to unearth what the text would rather leave buried. Tarek?
I think also, in addition to what Will said, what's interesting about this particular scene is that it's as if like Sarah Jane, like she reads a microaggression as an overt aggression, as in like she reads what some Laura Meredith might seem as like an innocent comment. She reads it as something that's like casting her blankly, just like her mother, and completely putting her down. And so she responds to it in perhaps the same way she might respond to like an overt aggression. And this just reminded me of like in like an American context, if you're thinking of well, people say, oh, like you'd rather be like a liberal Democrat than like a Republican because like it's socially better or whatever. But there's like in like being liberal in that sense, there's also like microaggressions in there that are like overt in being a Republican. So it's in like a similar sense, she kind of like identifies like the prejudiced element of what Laura Meredith is saying.
Yes, that's exactly right. She homes in on it. And she isn't simply content to just say outright what it is that both her mother and Laura Meredith are assuming. She doesn't walk into the room and simply say, what you're doing here shows that you are treating both myself and my mom like slaves. That's not what she does. She draws on Laura Meredith's example. In other words, she will take something that she has learned from Laura Meredith. And what has she learned from Laura Meredith that she mobilizes and weaponizes in this scene? Marcel?
Acting and pretending to be something that you're not, or idealizing what you are. So Laura spends a lot of time like trying to be the perfect white woman. I'm sorry if you can hear that. While Sarah Jane is trying to like act as this like the picturesque version of like what the Black woman is supposed to be.
Yes, that's exactly right. She is going to take the power of performance, and she has seen that power up close and personal. She's had a front row seat to the power that women can gain and can accumulate if they perform, because she has seen Laura Meredith move from a struggling actress to an A-list celebrity. So this is the first time, and this is something Sarah Jane will continue to do in the film, where she performs, where she will turn to performance to gain power. Why or how does that, or is that amplified by our understanding of passing? Why would Sarah Jane be drawn to performance as a potential tool, as a weapon? The film does this so that it speaks to, resonates with the problematic of passing. Emma?
I think it's kind of used as a way for her to like escape her life and like escape the box that she's been put in by her race and her family and like those that she's related to like in her youth that know her background and all of that. So she goes and performs a completely different lifestyle where no one knows her, and so she can pass as who she's performing as.
Yes, that's exactly right. In other words, there is, for Sarah Jane, this is where the seed is planted, that if only she acts and performs well enough, she can pass. The two will become intimately tied. And she will come to believe that by performing, she will be able to pass. And we will see that in two more scenes that we will analyze. Will?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, like, kind of along the lines of what Emma was saying, that like because of her racial ambiguity, in the same way that like gender and race are social constructs, and that gender is performed, because of Sarah Jane's racial ambiguity, the only way people will know her race is through performance, like social performances, and like adhering to like what people expect of her from both kind of camps of generalizing her. And I also think it's interesting that we attribute this like skill of acting that she gained to Laura versus like her using it as a legitimate survival technique.
Right, exactly. And here's where we would separate them, right? In this scene, the goal is not to survive. In this scene, the goal for Sarah Jane is to expose. The goal for Sarah Jane is to attack. The goal for Sarah Jane is to be on the offense, is to mock Laura Meredith and to call out Laura Meredith, not just to her face, but in front of these two people that are going to play an integral part in her ability to scale ever greater heights. But you're exactly right to point out that when we divorce this scene from passing, in passing, there is no longer the possibility, there is the demand that one perform. And there is, again, the punishment, the fear, the censorship that could raise its head if the performance fails, if the performance falters in some way. And that is actually going to be the next scene that we will analyze. What happens when the mask slips? What happens when the performance fails? This scene is also a representation of melodrama using the mise-en-scène to comment and speak on the actions that, that the camera captures. This freeze frame in particular is an example of this. What does this do? Having us, well, no, I shouldn't say anything else. What does this scene do in showing us these railings or this decorative wall element in the room? Will?
This might be like looking too deeply, but it could be like a visual representation of racial difference, whereas like the crossbars are kind of like whiteness, whereas the circles are the racial other, and Sarah Jane is kind of like obstructed in that she falls right in the middle of the two of them.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. I think it's a really valid reading. It gives us a bifurcation of the space. It splits the space into two halves, and we've just seen Sarah Jane perform race in a way that Laura Meredith would rather deny exists in her house, or she would call upon in her house. What else are we made aware of as a spectator when we see this, when this is superimposed on the action that we just saw? Okay, we'll put a pin in this because the film will return to railings and to divisions in rooms again and again. And there's another scene later on in which that will become visible. In this next scene, I want you to analyze specifically how the dynamics of melodrama, the investment in objects, and imbuing those objects with symbolic meaning is used. And specifically, I want you to analyze the role that the mirror and Sarah Jane's mirror image is going to play in this next scene. I want you to look at the composition in the frame. I want you to pay attention to the musical cues in this next scene. And I want you to tie Sarah Jane's failure to pass in this scene, her failure to perform, with the melodramatic strategies, the formal strategies that the film uses. So how are the two being amplified in this next scene?
She belonged to you.
I think.
Frankie, you're late. I thought you'd never get here. Let's walk down by the river. I want to talk to you.
We can talk here.
Frankie, I'm having trouble at home.
Your mother?
Yes. Frankie, you said you wanted to take a job in Jersey. Couldn't we run away? I'd do anything to be with you. Anything.
That's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea at all. Just tell me one thing.
Yes?
Is it true?
Is what true?
Is your mother a nigger? Tell me. Tell me!
What difference does it make? You love me.
All the kids talking behind my back. Is it true?
No!
Are you black?
No, I'm as white as you!
You're lying!
I'm not! I'm not!
Oh, that felt so good.
Is there anyone who would like to begin to unpack this particularly harrowing scene? And then this coda. Eliza?
One thing that I noticed was that, well, with the music, was that when he started like beating her up, it almost sounded like like not, I guess, suspenseful, yes, but also almost like an action movie. Not so much as something that should be taken seriously, but just kind of like, oh, like it's kind of almost more for entertainment and not more like to show how much it hurts her as a character.
Exactly. The music would seem to indicate that we're excited. The spectator is now excited. What is the effect of that, of having this music that almost points to a type of jubilance or excitement at what is happening on the screen? Caroline?
I would say that it in a sense lowers the merit of this scene that we're experiencing. Like, instead of it being a serious scene that's taken really heavily, for the reason that the director chose, this music is like forcing us to not take it as seriously as it should be. Like, this is like a man beating up this girl because of her race, and it's like awful, and yet we are not hearing this like music that really fits with the mood, so it kind of like juxtaposes between those two, and like almost causes the spectator to question like how serious it really is.
I think you're exactly right. It causes the spectator to question. In other words, if the music had been the type of dramatic music that we would expect to hear in such a scene, we would not question, we would not take a step back from the scene itself, and we would not begin to question what it is that we saw on the screen. Whereas this musical cue is jarring. This musical cue is asynchronous. It doesn't work with the scene. It upsets an easy identification with the text. It separates us from the text. The question is, how do you reinterpret what is happening as the result of this asynchronous musical cue, this forced separation from the text? Spruce?
I feel like the music in the context of the violence in this scene kind of reinscribes like the Black female body in like voyeuristic pleasure, and it erases or kind of problematizes, but in like a silencing way, all of the oppositional or challenging moments that Sarah Jane brought up in terms of race throughout the film.
Yes, I think that's such a well-argued reading. It puts the viewer in the position of voyeur. It implicates the viewer in this process of gaining pleasure from the physical assault that Sarah Jane undergoes. The railing that I showed earlier also puts the viewer in that same position. We are made aware of the act of spectatorship itself. If the railing had not been there, we would not have been aware of the act of looking. Film, classical film, this is another point that Laura Mulvey makes, wants to make us forget that we are spectators. It wants to make us forget that we're watching a text that has been produced. So as a text, it would never put objects in the path of looking. It would never want to make us aware of the fact that we're spectators. The previous scene, where Sarah Jane acted out this stereotype of the slave girl, was one that we could derive pleasure from. We could derive pleasure from the performance, from Sarah Jane's skill. In the same way that she commands the room, she commands our attention, but only if we're not aware of the fact that there's a performance that is happening. By forcing us to look through those slats, through the railing, we are implicated in this act of spectatorship. This next scene drives home the moral implications of that even more so, where the text is forcing us to say, find pleasure in this. You will derive pleasure from this. And that's why this coda here, the editing, the ways in which that scene leads into this scene is so telling. What is it that Laura Meredith says immediately following this absolutely traumatic scene? What were her first words?
Behind my back.
Graduation.
It's going to be hard to find. No.
Oh, that felt so.
What is the film saying here? Will.
She says, oh, that felt so good, as Annie is massaging her feet, which is like a pretty subjugated position to be in. And it also kind of reacts to, like Spruce was saying, about like the cinematic pleasure of the music, kind of trying to like evoke that disturbing sense of pleasure in you. It's like the white voice of the movie speaking to and agreeing and reaffirming that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We have here Laura Meredith channeling how white spectators may have just derived pleasure from the physical assault that Sarah Jane was subjected to. Ah, that feels good. Didn't that feel good to finally see Sarah Jane be put in her place, to finally see Sarah Jane have to pay for what she's trying to do? The film is almost perversely calling out how white spectators might derive pleasure from what they just saw. Will?
I remember like when you first had us watch the scene, you told us to like look at the mirror and kind of interpret what the point of the mirror was. I think there's like a double purpose. The first one, sticking with this theme of like voyeuristic pleasure. If we're looking at it through a mirror or through a reflection, it's less real, and we're more able, like the viewer's more able to detach themselves from like the reality of the violence. Just like you said, like the bars kind of remind us, for spectators, looking at the mirror makes it easier to get that sense of pleasure. And I also think it represents how like throughout the movie, we've kind of been tethered to Sarah Jane's perspective of herself and her own internal struggles. But this fight in the context of the mirror kind of reminds us, like, while she may see herself like this is how society and the world interprets her.
Absolutely brilliant, Will. That is exactly right. Remember, Sarah Jane is wholly convinced that she can pass. She says multiple times throughout the film, I'm white because I look it. In other words, what the mirror shows Sarah Jane is whiteness. What it reflects back to her is whiteness. In this scene, the mirror works against Sarah Jane. It is no longer aligned with Sarah Jane's genetic, biological understanding of race. Up until this point in the film, Sarah Jane believes and holds on to an essentialistic, biological, what we could call phenotypical understanding of race. She looks white, therefore she is white. And the mirror confirms to her that she is white. As soon as we enter the alleyway, the camera turns around to show us the mirrored reflection first before we see Sarah Jane. And we then see her boyfriend lean against the mirror. In other words, the mirror is now no longer aligned with Sarah Jane. It's no longer a tool of Sarah Jane's. It's a tool of the white supremacist patriarchy. It's a tool of her boyfriend to expose her for what he believes she is. So a reversal is enacted, not simply a reversal in thinking, a reversal in the ideology of race itself. This is where the film separates race as a biological, immovable entity versus race as a social construction, versus race as discourse, versus race as bound up in systems of representation. And it's as if the text has to forcefully disabuse Sarah Jane of the notion that she will ever be able to pass. And it shows her what the consequence is, or it shows all of the force that Sarah Jane has invested in believing that she can pass as white, has to doubly affect her so that she is rid of that belief. Why are we in this alleyway? What's the significance of the space itself that we're in? Sarah Jane says, can't we go walk by the river? Let's go walk by the river. But they don't. He doesn't let her. They need to stay in that alleyway. Why? Marcel?
Because the alleyway is hidden from like the public, and he doesn't want to be seen with her, because he makes a point of saying like everyone's talking behind my back, so he cares very much like what he looks like and what he's portraying.
Yes, that's exactly it. This alleyway is a semi-public, semi-private space, one that is separated from the outside world in which he worries about his standing in white society. But this is a transitional space. This exists between the house and the outside world that, that Sarah Jane hopes that they can elope to. But it's clear that they will find no comfort, or that she will find no comfort in this world. What's another effect of having this scene follow the scene that we just saw? We just saw a representation of whiteness that is damning. And then we have this. We have again a representation between, or an interaction between a white person and a person of color. What is the film saying by having this scene follow the other scene? It's so tonally different. Lainey?
So I think this is kind of like interesting since Sarah Jane is like mixed, I guess, and then it kind of cuts to like Annie and Laura, who are kind of like opposites in a way in this film. Like they kind of are like the contrasting characters in terms of race, and it's like just an image of like what role in society they're supposed to be playing. So Laura is like in a fancy dress, like lounging on the couch while Annie rubs her feet. So I think like it kind of represents the two roles that the two races like are supposed to play in society, following someone who's like conflicted about which identity they have and which role they have to play.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lainey. Claudia?
I think it could also represent like the varying levels of racism that exist. Like the previous scene is like a very explicit, like violent depiction of racism, whereas here it's more, it's obviously still explicit, but it's a lesser kind of racism. Like Annie's obviously in a subverted position and taking care of a white woman, even though their relationship is like more complicated than that. I just think like having them back to back just shows how like racism exists in many types of forms, and it's not always as like present as you think it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The film, by purposefully choosing to have this scene follow the assault scene, is showing us that this white supremacist thinking infuses both of these scenes. It connects both of these scenes. When we're thinking of editing, we're thinking of logical connections. We're thinking of thematic coherence. What this film shows is that we have white supremacist thinking, we have racism operative in both of these scenes. The difference is in degree, not in kind. We're dealing with the exact same structures of domination, but in differing degrees. After this scene, Sarah Jane leaves. Sarah Jane goes out on her own, no longer chooses to be part of this family, and she turns fully to a life of performance. And I want you specifically to very closely analyze this next scene, which will be Sarah Jane's performance at Harry's nightclub. This scene is a masterclass in melodrama, a true masterclass. Look at every single corner of your computer screen and analyze what role the objects that you see, the camera angles, the lyrics of the song. Pay extra close attention to the lyrics of the song, to the performance itself, and look for relationships of looking in this text, specifically between Sarah Jane and Annie.
Can I help you, lady?
Is there a girl named Sarah Jane Johnson working in?
Never heard of her.
Loneliest word I heard of is empty. Anything empty is sad. An empty purse can make a good girl bad. You hear me, Dad? Loneliest word I've heard of is empty. Empty things make me so mad. So fill me up with what I already have. Now Venus, you know, was loaded with charm, and look at what happened to her. Waiting around, she's minus 2 arms. Could happen to me, no sir. Now is the time to fill what is empty. Fill my life brim full of charm. Help me refill these empty arms.
Who would like to start? Caroline.
So I have like 3 main thoughts about this scene. The first one is that Annie is looking through this screen, and she is like very physically separated from the space. So this is clearly a space that she is not welcome. Like you see I don't know if he's like a host or whoever this man is that's like leading people in. His tone of voice shows that she, as a Black woman, is clearly not welcome. And then also like when the scene begins and Sarah Jane starts this song, the camera angle is like set between the men at this front table. So like it's as if we, the spectator, were also a white man looking at Sarah Jane, which kind of like reinforces this like this concept of the male gaze, and how like we are kind of participating in this scene as one of the men. And then also like the lyrics, how they say like now is the time to fill what is empty. It's kind of like metaphorically representative of Sarah Jane's desire to pass and to like feel as though she is white, or like fits this concept of whiteness that she desires.
Caroline, that is absolutely masterful, just masterful. How does, or where does Sarah Jane turn for a representation or a performance of whiteness? Why does she do this? Eliza?
I feel like part of it is because like she herself like knows of her racial status, so I feel like part of her feels like she's like in this line of work that usually a white woman would have to be very poor, not somebody that would have her kind of upbringing would kind of debase themselves in that way. So it's like she doesn't, like she wants to be out on her own, but she doesn't know how else to make money other than to do something that a white woman in her kind of situation would have to do if they were just poor and not out on their own and having to make a life for themselves, per se.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Lainey?
I think also she's kind of placing herself in like the a male dominated, or I guess patriarchal society, as a she like takes on the role as a white woman by like sexualizing herself and kind of like um dancing like for men and stuff. She kind of, I don't know, it makes me think of like the male gaze and stuff, and like her putting herself in that position to seem more white, I guess.
Yes, Lainey, I think you're exactly right. In other words, Sarah Jane's performance here, or her thinking, is that the only way she will ever be racially emancipated is if she turns instead to an already existing gendered binary. In other words, she trades in one category of domination for another category of domination. She believes that the only way in which she can successfully subvert racialized thinking is to conform to gender thinking. And this performance is a performance that is catered clearly to a male gaze. But what does that mean for the potential of this performance to be subversive? Why is Sarah Jane doomed? Why will this never work? Catherine?
This kind of reminded me of when Hooks was talking about how Black women would never want to see themselves in in a position that was occupied by white women, where they were kind of viewed as objects by the male gaze. And I feel like because she's trying to occupy that space, that kind of like ostracizes her in a way, and kind of just sets her up for failure, because that's not who she is, and she's not meant to be in that kind of position under the typical like views of the like racist and sexist society.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely beautiful, Catherine. Romy?
I was really caught throughout the scene by the masks on the wall, the white acting representation of the smiling and frowning faces. And that to me kind of felt like the influence of Laura Meredith on Sarah Jane, and her like this white actress influence onto what she sees as white success and white femininity, and trying to emulate that in the only way that it's available to her. But there are also these mocking faces that shows her as a subject of, as a subject of the gaze in the negative way that it is harmful to women. So it's her grasping at these aspirations, but really still being the object of dominant structures.
Precisely. That is just absolutely sterling and brilliant, Romy. This is an imitation of life. This is an imitation of Laura Meredith's life. This is Sarah Jane attempting to imitate, attempting to replicate the success that Laura Meredith has had. She turns to a stage in the same way that Laura Meredith turned to the stage. But this is doomed to fail because this performance is an imitation of an imitation. It is a copy of a copy, a replica of a replica, and it will not work for her. And you're so right to point out that these masks, which represent the very craft of acting, also represent a mask that slips, a mask that shows the performer behind the performance, and a mockery of the performance itself. We have, and this is also crucial, we have Sarah Jane lip syncing the words. Sarah Jane isn't singing these words, she's lip syncing the words. In other words, we don't have a real performance, we have what we could call a type of realness, something adjacent to the real. This is her attempting, but never quite being able to grasp whiteness. Whiteness will always be beyond her grasp. The best that she can do is to go through the motions. And that's what this scene is. Lip syncing is a going through the motions of singing without actually singing. Will?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that going back to the lyrics, she says, time to fill up all this empty, and she opens her arms up wide. And going back to your question of why is she doomed to fail, is because she's saying, she's basically calling herself empty, and she's asking the audience to ascribe meaning to her. But as we've seen in the scene, in the fight in the alley, like whenever people ascribe meaning to her, it's not the meaning she wants. So she's basically chasing after society to like give her the answer she wants, even though it will never ever do so.
Exactly. Yes, you're exactly right. And the irony is that when she looks in the mirror, she sees it. But it's the discrepancy between this mirror image of herself and the image that the world has of her. And the distance between the two can never be bridged. And that is the core problem that animates melodramas. Our representation of ourselves that we access invariably fails to live up to the ways in which the world, aka other people, perceive us. There is always going to be a distance that can never be fully bridged. There is a lack there, there is an absence there. Remember, we can trace this all the way back to the mirror stage. After we complete the mirror stage as a process, we are left with a sense of alienation from ourselves, with a persistent sense of lack, that we're not as good as that mirror image. Well, the very notion of passing exponentially increases that sense of lack, that sense of emptiness that Sarah Jane feels. Listen to the lyrics. Specifically, anything empty is sad. An empty purse can make a good girl bad. You hear me, Dad. The absent father, right? The person we never see. The subject who played an integral role in Sarah Jane's identity. It's a calling out to this absent figure who played a crucial role in determining where Sarah Jane is now. I want us to end by returning to Annie and by returning to Hooks. We have here a spectatorial relationship. We have Annie as a Black woman forced into a spectatorial position. She can only watch, and as Caroline beautifully put it, only at a distance, only when she's separated. Analyze what happens here from a Hooksian perspective. What type of looking relationship do we have here? What does this film say about what it means to be a Black female spectator and to consume warped representations of Blackness. Does Annie derive pleasure from this? Is there the possibility of pleasure in this representation in what Annie sees? Will?
I mean, I feel like Annie is kind of like any parent. She's mortified. She's seeing her daughter, who she loves, kind of debase herself and sell her and like devalue her body for, you know, in essence, ravaging. You know, she's saying like, oh, like she's basically just like kind of pimping herself out in a way that like no parent, I imagine, ever wants to see their child do. So I feel like if anything, like the slats on the window and the fact that she's outside, yes, she's a viewer, but she's horrified.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Because yes, Caroline.
I would also say, like, when you ask if there's any chance that she derives pleasure from this at all, I would say that there is a possibility that she could derive pleasure from it, in the sense that she knows that Sarah Jane has wanted her whole life to pass and to kind of like go down this path of I don't know. I mean, there's something. I'm obviously not a mother, but I feel like when you see your child, when you know that your child wants something and has been fighting their whole life basically to achieve this one thing, there might be some sense of pleasure in knowing that, you know, she's achieving this goal in some way, shape, or form. I don't know.
Yeah. But at this point in the film, that's not where Annie has arrived yet. Because if you remember, the next thing she does is that she outs Sarah Jane. So she turns to the manager and does what she did when Sarah Jane was in grade school, and announces that she's her mother, which ends her career at this point in time. So again, it's the discrepancy. And this is another foundational characteristic of melodramas. Characters who love each other make decisions that only hurt each other. And at this point in the film, Annie, although she's driven by a love for her daughter, will end up hurting her daughter even more and pushing her further away, because she continuously brings in a reminder of Blackness that Sarah Jane wants to separate herself from. And it's not until the Moulin Rouge performance where she adopts the persona of Sarah Jane's mammy and not her mother that she begins to understand that she is hurting Sarah Jane by continually forcing Blackness onto her by emphasizing the parental tie that she has to Sarah Jane. But that is not a scene that we are getting to tonight. I will find some other way to maybe in a discussion board, an alternative assignment, extra credit, because I would love to hear your thoughts on the final confrontation between Annie and Sarah Jane in her motel room, which is another brilliantly haunting representation of the melodrama. For now, I want to thank you all again for logging into this online class. I hope you have a great Easter weekend. If there was ever a time for regeneration and renewal and resurrection, this is it. I think we're all owed exactly that after the past couple of weeks. And I will see you again on Monday for our discussion of widows. Thank you.